Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition combat can be pretty easy to learn and run, but at times the simplicity of it can also be its downfall. This isn't to say there aren't enough options for players, but the villains we put in front of the PCs are often a bit lackluster. If you're looking for ways to spice up combat, I have 3 tips in this video. I'm borrowing from RuneSmith and Matt Colville for a couple of these, but as with all my videos, I'm going to provide you with some unique examples of my own that you can implement or use as inspiration. These 3 additions to combat are terrain hazards, layer actions, and villain actions. The players expect to deal with enemies in combat, but sometimes they have to deal with the terrain as well. Adding difficult and impassable terrain can change the dynamic of the battlefield to some degree, yet there are other ways to influence the PC's movement and actions in a similar vein. Terrain hazards are active or reactive locations on the battle map that can hinder characters in some way. How they do so is up to you, but I'll give you an example from my Unrest campaign. In their first adventure, the party found themselves on an old battlefield littered with the bones of fallen warriors. These skeletons eventually rose from the ground to attack the party. However, some of the skeletons weren't intact enough to move, but still tried to grab anyone who came near, making these bone piles a terrain hazard the party needed to avoid. This is also a combat I planned for my Ancient Dwarven Outpost 5-room dungeon. If you plan to use that dungeon in your own game and want to spice up combat a little, feel free to include this battle map, linked in the description. Hazards like this can take many forms and could vary depending on the environment. In a jungle clearing, the party may have to avoid nests of poisonous snakes hidden in the underbrush while fighting ferocious cannibals. Deep underground, a mind flayer cave might hold enchanted gemstones embedded atop stalagmites that stun individuals who get too close. The possibilities are endless. As RuneSmith stated in his video on the topic, layer actions shouldn't be limited to legendary monsters. Any creature found in its home territory could have access to level-appropriate layer actions. I'd recommend watching his video as he has a few comical yet worthwhile examples of this. But of course, I'll include a few of my own here. Blights are sentient, evil plant creatures that are created by something known as a Gulthias tree. The grove of a Gulthias tree is filled with brambles, toxic weeds, and whatever blights it spawns. Within this vile grove, the blights have their following layer actions. They can entangle a section of the forest floor, turning it into difficult terrain and forcing creatures to make a DC 12 strength save or be restrained for up to a minute. The restrained creature can attempt a DC 12 strength check on subsequent turns to end this condition. The blights can also launch a hail of thorns from the overhanging branches of the Gulthias tree, dealing 1d10 piercing damage to a single target who fails a DC 12 dexterity save, or half as much if the target succeeds. Finally, these creatures can use the toxic weeds in the area to spew forth poisonous spores at one of their enemies. These spores function as a ray of sickness, dealing 2d8 poison damage to a target and forcing them to make a DC 12 Constitution save. If the target fails, it is also poisoned for 1 turn. A ghast commanding a small cluster of ghouls may plague a local graveyard, claiming it as their lair. Such a location could lead to some frightful lair actions. Drawing from my first example of hazardous terrain, the ghast could partially animate the buried corpses in the graveyard, restraining enemies standing on or near a grave on a failed DC 13 strength save, or breaking free on the following rounds with a DC 13 strength check. Unlike the hazardous terrain example, though, the PCs won't be aware of this effect until it is used against them. Another layer action that can be used focuses on the necromantic energy of the graveyard and its negative effects on the living. The ghast can hex a target to deal an extra 1d6 necrotic damage every time that individual is struck by the ghast or one of its ghouls. In addition, the target suffers disadvantage on either athletics or acrobatics checks for the next hour. And lastly, these undead can utilize the insects drawn by the rotting flesh within the graveyard to summon a cloud of biting flies that fills a 10-foot by 10-foot area, dealing 1d6 piercing damage to anyone within the cloud. Such is the nature of battling undead on their terms. Gargoyles typically roost in mountains or on castle battlements, often in the employ of evil spellcasters. Their lair actions would likely involve Earth-based magic or simply utilizing the architecture of such locations. First, the gargoyles could hinder their opponents with the use of spiked growth on a stone surface, infusing the area with jagged rocks. This turns the area into difficult terrain and deals 2d4 piercing damage for every 5 feet traveled, but is unnoticeable without a successful DC 10 perception check. Second, the gargoyles can dislodge a section of damaged masonry or crumbling statue to fall upon a hapless victim. Avoiding the deadfall requires a DC 12 dexterity save, and deals 2d6 points of bludgeoning damage if failed. One last lair action these stone villains can use is to animate a normal statue to aid them in combat. A medium-sized statue has the statistics of an animated armor from the monster manual, and will aid the gargoyle for 1d4 plus 1 rounds of combat, or until another lair action is used. In his video on action-oriented monsters, Matt Colville introduces the idea of villain actions. These are similar to legendary actions, but for any level monster. And when using a group of monsters, he recommends only using one villain action per turn, as well as theming each action to a particular turn in combat. Take a look at his video for more information on how to use these types of actions in your game, and for 2 examples of low-level monsters that use these actions. Here are some that I've prepared for my own campaigns. In Shoals of Pain, Mayor Nicholas Ovander of Belladonna was a self-righteous and elitist paladin who saw the native lizard folk of Quisqueya as nothing more than slaves to be used or savages to be converted. He used his power and office to lure the lizard folk chieftains to a feast in their honor, where he intended to burn them alive and then subdue their tribes. A battle between himself and the PCs was inevitable. Ovander was a 3rd-level paladin with 2 2nd-level fighters as bodyguards. His villain actions consisted of the following, named for the phrase he shouted when using them, in traditional Matt Colville style. At the end of round 1, Nicholas shouts, "The gods are on my side," and casts Shield of Faith on himself. After round 2, the paladin points at a PC and yells, "Kneel, infidel!" That party member must make a DC 13 Wisdom save or fall prone. At the conclusion of the 3rd round, Ovander cries out, "For the crown!" He immediately makes an extra attack with advantage, unwilling to go down without a fight. In Unrest, the PCs had a multi-step side quest they were trying to complete while exploring the ancient Dwarven Empire of Bulwark. This quest was referred to as the Hochberg Pilgrimage. The pilgrimage included locating 3 statues dedicated to ancient Dwarven heroes. One of these heroes was Dampfer Nautilus, sailor of the underground seas. His statue was located in the middle of a cavernous ocean and guarded by a lesser water elemental known as Delta. Delta guarded the statue on behalf of the dwarves. Its duty was not to kill those who approached, but simply test their resolve. If they could reach the statue, Delta would leave them in peace, congratulating them on their achievement. Because of this, the elemental's villain actions dealt mostly with movement and positioning of its opponents. Delta's round 1 villain action was to create a 10-foot wide by 60-foot long wave that knocked back anyone who tried to approach the statue. Those struck by the wave had to succeed on a DC 15 dexterity save or be pushed away 20 feet. Following round 2, the elemental manifested a globe of water around an enemy spellcaster, effectively grappling that PC and forcing a DC 14 athletics or acrobatics check to break free each round. This also restricted the character's breathing, since they were underwater, and could potentially ruin any spell cast while inside the globe, if it had a verbal component. A DC 14 Constitution save was necessary to successfully cast such a spell. By round 3, Delta was focused directly on the statue and keeping everyone away. The water elemental unleashed a sheet of magical ice on the statue's 15-foot by 15-foot base, turning it into difficult terrain and forcing anyone to try to climb onto it to make a DC 14 dexterity save or fall back into the water. Those who successfully reached the statue of the ancient dwarven sailor had truly proven themselves worthy. Another elemental-based combat I used recently in Unrest involved a pyromancer by the name of Gear Espen and his summoned fire elemental companion, Brimstone. Throughout combat, Gear sticks behind the raging elemental, taunting the PCs each round while using his own abilities in conjunction with those of the elemental. For round 1, the Pyromancer targets Brimstone with a Burning Hand spell, extending it out into a 30-foot cone from the elemental. On round 2, Gear finishes up by tossing a vial of Alchemist Fire into the living inferno. The vial explodes, dealing 2d4 fire damage to everyone within 10 feet, instead of the normal 1d4 to a single target. As with Alchemist Fire's normal effect, targets continue to take 1d4 fire damage on subsequent rounds until they make a successful DC 10 dexterity save to extinguish the flames. By round 3, Gear is looking for a way out. He tosses a bag of dried herbs into Brimstone before retreating. The herbs burn quickly, filling the cavern with black smoke. All remaining combatants, including the elemental, are effectively blinded, giving them disadvantage on attack rolls and automatically failing perception checks involving sight. Brimstone's intense heat burns away the smoke by the following round, but by that time Gear may be long gone, leading to a future encounter with even more deadly surprises. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Coming up next week, we'll be delving into Scandal at Spire Cathedral, an event-based spy room dungeon. Following that, I'll be launching a new series called A Dot on the Map, which will showcase fantastic locations which dungeon masters can drop into their worlds whenever they need a diversion or side quest, while players can use the people, places, and events provided in this series to add more depth and flavor to their characters' backstories. Starting off this series will be Hathmead Brewery, a tavern the size of a small town. With that much alcohol in hand, there should be plenty of adventures just waiting to happen. I'm David Watches, and thanks for watching.